The rain came down in waves, so heavy it blurred the edges of the streetlights, turning the world into a watercolor of silver and shadow. Her coat was already soaked through, but she didn't care. She had been running without thinking, chasing a voice she wasn't even sure was real. The air was sharp with the scent of wet earth and cold wind, the kind that cuts into your skin and makes you feel alive and exposed all at once. Somewhere between the crack of thunder and the hiss of water rushing into the gutters, she saw him. He was standing in the middle of the street, the rain falling around him like shards of glass catching the light. For a moment, she thought her mind was playing tricks on her, that her exhaustion and longing had finally blurred the line between dream and reality. But then he turned his head. His eyes met hers, and something deep inside her shifted, like a locked door creaking open after centuries of silence. She didn't notice her own feet moving until she was in front of him. The storm howled between them, wind whipping her hair into her face, but she didn't look away. She could see every drop of water clinging to his lashes, the way his breath formed small clouds in the cold night air. He reached for her hand, not urgently, not hesitantly, but with the certainty of someone who had done it 1,000 times before. His fingers were warm despite the rain, a warmth that sank straight into her bones. And then he spoke. Just 6 words, barely louder than a whisper, but they sliced through the storm like they had been waiting for this exact moment to be heard. Words she knew, not because she had ever heard them before in this life, but because they lived in her. The same words that had haunted her dreams since she was a child. She froze, not out of fear, but because the weight of that recognition was almost unbearable. The street around them seemed to disappear. The world was nothing but the sound of his voice echoing in her mind and the pulse that thundered in her chest. She remembered standing under a different sky with stars instead of streetlights, the scent of firewood instead of asphalt. The rain wasn't rain, it was the spray of the ocean, and his face was lit by the flames of a small lantern. The same eyes, the same voice, the same promise. She tried to speak, but her lips felt heavy, as if her own words were trapped behind centuries of silence. The only thing she could manage was a soft, trembling breath. He smiled faintly, almost as if to say he understood, and for a heartbeat, he was certain time had folded in on itself, bringing them back to the place where everything began. But the wind shifted, snapping the moment in half. A car roared by in the distance, a reminder that this was the present, that the past she felt so vividly could not be real. And yet, how could it not? Her palm still tingled where his hand had been. She knew the exact texture of his voice, the cadence of those words. It was as if every year of her life had been leading to this encounter. Every dream a breadcrumb leading her here. She wondered if he could hear her heart. It wasn't beating fast from the shock. It was beating like it was remembering an old rhythm, one it had once known by heart. The storm didn't feel cold anymore. Every drop of rain seemed to hum with recognition. She could almost believe the world had been holding its breath for this meeting, that every coincidence, every strange deja vu had been a thread pulling her toward this instant. Her thoughts swirled like the rain at their feet. Had she been waiting for him without knowing it? Was every failed relationship, every fleeting connection just a shadow of this moment? His gaze didn't waver. It was steady, unshaken by the chaos around them, and in that steadiness she felt something she couldn't name, something both terrifying and safe. The thunder rolled again, closer this time, and a flash of lightning lit his face. For the briefest instant, she saw another version of him, dressed in clothes that didn't belong to this century, eyes darker, jaw sharper, holding her hand under a sky dusted with unfamiliar stars. She blinked and he was back in the present, but the image clung to her like the scent of rain on skin. She swallowed hard, the question forming on her tongue before she could stop it. But before the words could leave her, he stepped closer, the space between them narrowing until the storm felt far away. His breath was warm against her cheek, his hand still holding hers as if letting go wasn't an option. And then, just like in her dreams, he leaned in, not to kiss her, not yet, but to speak again, his voice low, carrying something ancient and unshakable. It wasn't just a greeting, it wasn't just recognition, it was a claim, a reminder, and a wound reopening all at once. And deep down, she already knew this was not the first time they had met under a storm, nor would it be the last. The next morning, she woke with the lingering sensation of rain on her skin, though her sheets were warm and dry. For a moment, she thought it had been another dream, until she saw the faint outline of his handprint against hers. It wasn't physical, not something that could be photographed or shown, but she felt it there, like a ghostly warmth she couldn't shake. The words he'd spoken replayed in her mind on an endless loop, each repetition pulling at threads she didn't know existed in her memory. At the kitchen table, she wrapped her fingers around a mug of coffee, staring out at the damp streets. Every detail of the storm had been burned into her. The smell of the air before the rain, the way the lightning traced silver cracks across the sky, the sound of his voice breaking through the chaos. It was absurd, she told herself, to believe in things like past lives or centuries-old promises. And yet, when she closed her eyes, she could feel the grain of the wooden dock beneath her bare feet, the distant call of gulls, the flicker of firelight on his face, images she had no business remembering. She tried to distract herself with work, errands, the noise of the everyday, but it followed her. In the crowd at the market, she caught the back of a man's head and thought it was him. In the reflection of a shop window, she swore she saw his outline behind her. Every stranger's voice was a possible echo, every unfamiliar smile a shadow of something once familiar. It was as if the meeting in the storm had shifted the focus of her entire world, turning everything into a search for pieces of him. That night, she found herself digging through an old wooden box in the attic, one she hadn't opened in years. Inside were the usual fragments of a childhood, faded photographs, mismatched buttons, pressed flowers from a school trip. But buried under it all was something she didn't remember owning, a small weathered journal with a cracked leather cover. There was no name, no date, no obvious sign of its origin. When she opened it, the handwriting inside was neat, deliberate, and written in a style that seemed older than the paper itself. The entries were brief, some just single sentences. "The sea is rough tonight, but she will come. I have made the promise again. This time I will keep it." The words sent a tremor through her. She read for hours, each page feeling both foreign and intimately hers, until she reached a sentence that made her breath catch. "If I do not return, remember me when the sky breaks open and the rain tastes of salt." She didn't realize she was crying until the ink on the page blurred. In the days that followed, the pull toward him became undeniable. It wasn't just longing, it was as if the world itself was conspiring to bring them together. The weather forecast shifted unexpectedly to storms. Her commute kept being interrupted by detours through unfamiliar streets, and each time, something about the air told her she was close. It was illogical, impossible even, but she had stopped caring about logic. Logic had never given her the feeling she had in the storm. One evening, unable to resist, she went back to the exact street where they had stood. The rain hadn't started yet, but the sky was heavy with it, a deep blue-gray that promised a downpour. She stood there, her pulse loud in her ears, watching the clouds roll in. Every instinct screamed that he would be there. She didn't know how she knew, only that the certainty felt as old as her bones. A single drop landed on her cheek, then another, and then just as the first rumble of thunder rolled overhead, she heard footsteps behind her. Slow, deliberate, unhurried, as if whoever it was knew she wasn't going to run. She turned, heart in her throat. He was there, not in the exact same clothes, not framed by lightning this time, but unmistakable. His eyes locked on hers, and the street seemed to quiet, the air thickening between them. He didn't speak right away. Instead, he stepped closer, his gaze searching her face as if confirming she was real. When he finally reached her, he lifted his hand and brushed away a raindrop from her cheek. The gesture was so familiar it hurt. She wanted to ask him everything. Who he was, what he knew, if he remembered the same things she did, but the words tangled in her throat. He smiled faintly, that same almost sad curve of his lips she had seen in the storm. "You came back," he said, and though the sentence was simple, it was laced with something deeper, as if it wasn't meant just for this night, or even this life. She didn't answer. She couldn't. All she could do was stand there, the rain beginning to fall in earnest, each drop stitching her more tightly into whatever story they had started lifetimes ago. Somewhere, far away in the recesses of her mind, a memory stirred. Not of a storm, but of a farewell on a sunlit day. His hand slipping from hers as the tide rose between them. The same promise in his eyes. The same unspoken weight in her chest. It was as if the meeting now was the continuation of a sentence that had been cut short centuries before, and she was terrified and desperate to hear the rest. They began walking without deciding to, as if some invisible current was pulling them down the same narrow street. The rain had softened into a mist, clinging to their hair and clothes, blurring the glow of street lamps into pale halos. Neither of them spoke at first, but there was no discomfort in the silence. It was charged, the kind of silence that feels like it's carrying the weight of something unsaid. She noticed the way his hand stayed close to hers without quite touching, as if his body remembered a rule his mind hadn't explained. Finally, she broke the stillness. "Have we met before?" Her voice sounded small, almost fragile, against the sound of water dripping from the rooftops. He looked at her for a long moment, the corners of his mouth twitching into something between a smile and a confession. "Not in this life," he said softly, "but I've been looking for you for a very long time." The words landed in her chest like a stone dropped in deep water, ripples spreading, touching something old and unnameable. They turned a corner into a quieter street where the cobblestones were slick and shining. She could smell wood smoke drifting from somewhere far off, and for a moment her mind slipped again. She saw the same street but without cars, without neon signs, only lantern light and the rhythmic sound of hooves on stone. A memory? A hallucination? She didn't know anymore, but when she glanced at him there was no surprise in his eyes, as though he'd seen the same thing. He began to speak in fragments, as if testing whether the truth would frighten her away. He talked about a promise made under a sky lit by torches, about being separated by a tide that neither of them could fight, about searching through years and lifetimes to find her again. His tone was calm, almost too calm, as if every word had been rehearsed in his mind countless times. And yet there was an undercurrent of urgency, like he feared he was running out of time to tell her everything. The further they walked, the more she realized her own memories were unraveling from the shadows. She could recall the exact texture of the rope they'd used to anchor a small fishing boat, the pattern of stars above a cliff where they once met in secret, the bitter taste of herbs he'd given her when she was sick. None of it belonged to the life she knew, and yet it all fit so perfectly that it made her chest ache. She wanted to ask him if he remembered the same details, but part of her feared that saying them aloud would make them vanish. They stopped in front of an old building with faded paint and a balcony that seemed to lean forward, as though straining to listen. He told her it was a place he came often, a place that felt like a fragment of the past had survived here. Inside, the air was warm and filled with the smell of tea leaves. The owner, a woman with silver hair pulled into a braid, greeted him with a familiarity that made her wonder just how many lives he'd quietly built around this search. He ordered for both of them without asking her preference, just as he had once done centuries ago when she was too shy to speak to strangers. The tea arrived, steaming in small porcelain cups, and when she took her first sip, her breath caught. The taste was exactly the same as the one she remembered from that other life. Earthy, slightly sweet, carrying a whisper of smoke. She set the cup down carefully, afraid her trembling fingers might shatter it. He watched her with an intensity that made the tiny room feel even smaller. "You feel it too," he said quietly. It wasn't a question. She nodded, unable to find the words. Outside, the rain began again, tapping against the window in uneven rhythms. It felt like the sound of a clock counting down, though she didn't know to what. There was a moment when she almost asked him why now? Why after all this time had they found each other again? But something in his expression stopped her. His gaze drifted to the rain, and there was a shadow there. An unspoken warning, a flicker of sorrow. She realized then that finding each other might only be the beginning, and whatever had torn them apart before could still be waiting. When they finally stepped back outside, the night seemed darker than before. The streets were nearly empty, the pools of water reflecting the dim light like fragments of another world. He walked beside her, close enough that their arms brushed occasionally, and each touch felt deliberate, like a reminder that they were here, now, together. But beneath that warmth, there was a tension she couldn't quite name, a sense that something unseen was moving toward them. And in that tension, her curiosity deepened, because if promises could last hundreds of years, then so could the forces determined to break them. The days that followed blurred into a strange kind of reality, one where every moment felt both entirely new and impossibly familiar. She and he began to meet without even needing to arrange it, as if something in the air was pulling them into the same spaces. Sometimes it was by the old bookstore on the corner, other times in the quiet park where the trees arched overhead like cathedral ceilings. But every time it felt like stepping into a chapter they had already read, one they could recite from memory yet still longed to hear again. Still, with each meeting, she noticed the shadow in his eyes growing darker. He spoke often of the past, but never all at once, as if the story was too heavy to be told in a single breath. His memories came in fragments, sunlit afternoons on a distant shore, whispered vows under a blood-red moon, the feel of her hair tangled in the wind. They were beautiful images, but always cut short, as if something terrible waited just beyond them. She wanted to push him to tell her everything, but she sensed that rushing him might unravel whatever fragile thread had finally brought them together again. One evening, the air thick with the promise of another storm, they walked along the river. The water reflected the city lights in restless ripples, and the scent of rain drifted between them. It was there, in that half light, that he finally told her about the night everything had ended. His voice was quiet, almost reverent, as if speaking of it might disturb the balance of the present. He described a time long ago when their love had been forbidden, not by chance but by design. Powerful families, rival factions, a feud so old no one could remember its origin. He spoke of secret meetings by the shoreline, each one stolen from the jaws of danger, each one a gamble they both knew they could not win forever. And then he told her about the night of the betrayal, how someone they had trusted had led others to them, how the sound of approaching footsteps had been drowned by the roar of the ocean, how the tide had cut them off from escape. She listened, her chest tightening with each word. Though she had never heard the story before, it felt like she had lived it. Like her body remembered the cold bite of the water, the frantic pounding of her heart, the weight of the promise they had made even as they were torn apart. He looked at her then, his eyes reflecting both the man standing before her and the man from that night centuries ago, and she realized he carried not only the memory of their love, but the memory of his failure to protect it. After that confession, the city seemed to take on a sharper edge. She began noticing things she couldn't explain, the same man watching them from different corners, the same shadow passing under lamplight at night. Once, as they left the tea shop, she swore she saw the reflection of someone standing behind them in the glass, someone who wasn't there when she turned around. It was as though the forces that had conspired to separate them before had found their way into this life too, waiting for the moment to strike. One night, she dreamed again, only this time, it wasn't of the past. In the dream, they were running through a narrow alley as rain poured down, his hand gripping hers tightly. The air was thick with the sound of footsteps chasing them. She woke with her heart pounding, her palm tingling from the phantom feel of his grasp. When she told him about it later, his expression hardened in a way she had never seen before. He didn't dismiss it as a dream. He treated it as a warning. They began meeting in quieter places, away from crowded streets, speaking in hushed tones as though someone might be listening. He told her that promises like theirs didn't just survive lifetimes, they attracted attention, not all of it benevolent. Some bonds, he explained, were considered too powerful, too dangerous to be left unchecked. And those who had tried to end them once might not hesitate to try again. She wanted to believe they could outrun whatever this was, but the tension was growing, a silent pressure that seeped into every moment they shared. Even their laughter felt edged with urgency, as if they were trying to claim as much joy as possible before something came to take it away. The thought terrified her, but it also ignited a resolve she didn't know she had. If they had been given another chance after centuries of separation, she would not waste it. Yet somewhere deep in her, she knew this story was far from over, because love that spans lifetimes is never just a blessing, it is also a test, and the real trial, the one that had haunted them across centuries, was still on its way. The storm came without warning. One moment, the night was calm, the air heavy but still. The next, the sky split open with a roar of thunder that seemed to shake the ground beneath her feet. She had been walking home alone, the city streets slick from an earlier drizzle, when the first drops began to fall again. But this was different. Faster, colder, urgent, as if the rain itself carried a message she couldn't yet read. She quickened her pace, her eyes darting to the shadows between the buildings. Ever since his warning, she had been alert to the strange patterns, the same man on different corners, the reflection that didn't match what was in front of her. Tonight, the feeling was stronger than ever. She could feel it in her chest, a deep pull like a string tightening, and she knew without knowing how that he was near. When she turned the corner, she saw him. He was standing at the far end of the street, framed by the flickering glow of a broken street lamp. His coat was drenched, his hair plastered to his forehead, but his eyes, those same eyes that had found her across lifetimes, were locked on hers. Relief flooded her, but it was short-lived. There was urgency in his stance, a tension in the way his shoulders squared against the rain. She started toward him, but he lifted a hand, palm out, stopping her. "Don't move," he called over the wind. His voice was steady, but she heard the strain beneath it. Before she could ask why, a shadow detached itself from the darkness behind him. Another figure stepped into the dim light. Tall, faceless in the rain, yet somehow unmistakably hostile. She didn't recognize them, but every instinct screamed danger. He moved first, closing the distance between them in a few quick strides, his hand reaching for hers. The moment their fingers touched, the world seemed to tilt. The rain roared louder, the light around them dimmed, and for a heartbeat she was no longer in the city at all. She saw waves crashing against a jagged cliff, the taste of salt on her lips, and a lantern swaying wildly in the wind. She heard herself shouting his name, only it wasn't the name she knew him by now, and then it was gone. They ran. Neither of them spoke, their breath loud in the narrow streets as they wove through alleys and side passages she'd never noticed before. The rain turned the stones underfoot slick, forcing them to slow at sharp turns, but his grip on her never loosened. Every corner they turned felt like it could reveal safety or danger, and she didn't know which would be worse. Finally, they ducked into a small archway, the entrance to what looked like an abandoned courtyard. The storm's noise softened here, muted by the surrounding walls. He didn't let go of her hand. Instead, he leaned against the wall for a moment, catching his breath, eyes scanning the shadows. When he finally looked at her, his expression was unreadable, some mix of relief, fear, and something deeper she couldn't name. "They've found us," he said simply. The words landed with the weight of inevitability. He explained that the same forces that had torn them apart before had never truly disappeared. They had been waiting, dormant, for the right moment to act again. Every lifetime they had found each other, the same choice had been placed before them, fight to stay together or be torn apart once more. And every time something, fate, betrayal, or sheer bad luck had won against them. She listened, her mind spinning. It was too much to take in, yet every word felt like confirmation of something she'd always known deep down. She thought of the journal, of the dreams, of the unshakable feeling of recognition when she first heard his voice. It was all part of the same thread, a thread that had been woven centuries ago and refused to break. But why now? She asked. Why this life? His gaze softened, and for the first time that night, he smiled. Just barely. Because this time, he said, we might be able to finish what we started. There was a quiet certainty in his tone, but also an unspoken warning. The possibility of change came with the risk of failure, and failure now might mean there would be no next time. He stepped closer, the rain still dripping from his coat, and cupped her face in his hands. Do you trust me? The question hung between them, heavy and sharp. She thought of the lifetimes behind them, the storms weathered and promises kept, the moments stolen and the ones lost forever. Trust wasn't the question. It was the only thing she had left to give. She nodded. Somewhere beyond the courtyard, the storm raged on, and footsteps echoed faintly against wet stone. They weren't alone, and time was running out. But in that moment, standing there with him, she felt the same resolve she had glimpsed in his eyes. This time, they would not surrender. And as the shadow crossed the threshold of the archway, she realized the real test of their promise was about to begin.